Jim Lawson had always believed in the value of hard work, integrity, and keeping to himself. As a single father and a paramedic, he didn't have time for nonsense. His life revolved around long shifts at the hospital and making sure his 12-year-old son, Ethan, who had asthma, was safe and happy. When he moved into Willow Ridge Estates, a gated community known for its well-manicured lawns and family-friendly environment, he thought he had finally found a peaceful place to raise his son. For the first few weeks, everything seemed fine. The neighborhood was quiet, the houses were uniform in their charm, and the security of a gated entrance gave him peace of mind, especially for Ethan's safety. But it didn't take long for Jim to realize that peace came at a price. That price had a name: Karen Delacroix. Karen wasn't just the HOA president, she was its self-proclaimed queen. She ruled over Willow Ridge like a tyrant, enforcing the most absurd rules with an iron fist. Stories about her spread like whispers in the wind, forcing a family to repaint their home because their beige was too aggressive, measuring grass blade height with a ruler, fining a mother for having a pink lawn flamingo. No one dared to challenge her because Karen made sure to make an example out of anyone who did. Jim didn't pay much attention to her at first. He had no patience for HOA politics and was too busy juggling work and fatherhood. That was until he ran into his first problem with Karen. It started with something small, a minor inconvenience that should have been easy to fix. Every 2 weeks, the HOA changed the security gate code without notice. This was a huge issue for people like Jim, who worked overnight shifts. Getting locked out of his own neighborhood after a 12-hour shift was the last thing he needed. One evening, after barely catching a few hours of sleep, Jim approached the HOA office to ask a simple question: why does the security code keep changing so often? Karen sat behind the reception desk, sipping tea as if she owned the world. Her perfectly manicured nails clicked against her clipboard as she gave him a tight, patronizing smile. "Oh, Jim," she said, tilting her head like he was a misbehaving child. "The security code changes are for the safety of our residents. We can't have just anyone coming and going." Jim frowned. "I understand security, but don't you think it's excessive? I work night shifts. If I come home and the code has changed, I'm stuck outside until someone lets me in." Karen's smile didn't falter, but something in her expression shifted, something colder, sharper. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy, "maybe you should plan ahead. Responsible homeowners always check for updates." Jim exhaled through his nose, resisting the urge to argue. "I'd be happy to check if someone actually notified me." Karen let out a small, amused laugh. "Oh, Jim, we post updates on the community website. You should really be more proactive." Jim clenched his jaw. He hadn't received a single email, a single flyer, nothing. Just more HOA bureaucracy designed to make life difficult. At that moment, he realized the truth. This wasn't about security. This was about control. And Karen had just marked him as her next problem. Jim had always been the type to pick his battles. He wasn't the kind of guy to start fights over petty rules, and if dealing with Karen meant ignoring a few ridiculous HOA notices, so be it. He had bigger priorities: his job, his son, and keeping things running smoothly at home. But Karen wasn't the kind of person to let things go. After their conversation about the security gate, she made sure to make her presence felt. It started small. His security code suddenly stopped working one night when he came home from a shift. He had to call the HOA's emergency line, where Karen herself answered, her voice thick with false concern as she informed him that his code had been accidentally removed from the system. Then came the violations. His trash cans were half an inch too close to the curb. His porch light was too bright, despite being the same model as his neighbors. It was obvious. This wasn't about HOA rules. This was personal. Jim was annoyed, sure, but he didn't have time to wage war with a woman who measured power in neighborhood regulations. He figured if he ignored her, she'd get bored and move on. He was wrong. That night, Jim was just finishing up dinner when he heard it, the sharp, wheezing sound that sent ice through his veins. Ethan. He rushed to his son's room and found him sitting on the bed, hands gripping his chest, struggling to breathe. His asthma had been under control for months, but sometimes it still flared up. "Where's your inhaler?" Jim asked, already moving toward the bathroom cabinet where they kept the backups. Ethan shook his head, barely able to get the words out. I don't know." Jim tore through drawers, cabinets, bags, nothing. He could have sworn he had picked up a refill, but between work and everything else, had he forgotten? His mind raced, but he didn't have time for self-blame. Ethan was getting worse. Jim grabbed his phone and called 911. "My son's having an asthma attack, I need an ambulance right now." The dispatcher assured him they were on the way, and Jim's stomach twisted. They'd get there fast. But would they get in? He sprinted to the front door, not even bothering to grab his jacket. The HOA security gate was still a problem, and he wasn't going to take any chances. He ran down the street toward the entrance, his heartbeat hammering in sync with Ethan's ragged breaths in his ears. Then he saw her. Karen Delacroix stood at the gate's control panel, her arms crossed, watching him. Jim's stomach dropped. "Karen. An ambulance is coming for Ethan, open the gate." She tilted her head slightly, her lips curling into something that almost looked like amusement. "Oh, Jim," she said, tapping one manicured nail against the screen. "You know the rules. Emergency vehicles need prior authorization before entering." Jim could hardly process what he was hearing. "Are you serious? My son can't breathe, open the damn gate." Karen sighed as if he were being dramatic, then gave him a sympathetic shake of her head. "I understand this must be stressful for you," she said, her voice filled with fake concern, "but rules are rules. We had issues last year with unauthorized vehicles, and we simply can't make exceptions." Jim's hands curled into fists. "A child's life is at stake, and you're talking about rules?" Her expression remained perfectly composed. "Perhaps you should have ensured you had the proper medical supplies at home. We all have responsibilities." The sound of sirens in the distance sent a surge of relief through Jim, until Karen calmly pressed a button on the keypad. The screen blinked red, and with a quiet click, the gate locked. Jim couldn't breathe. "What the hell are you doing?" Karen folded her arms, her face completely impassive. "The HOA board has to approve emergency vehicle access in non-fire situations. I'd love to help, really, but if I make an exception for you, where do we draw the line?" Jim saw red. The ambulance pulled up on the other side of the gate, its lights flashing. Through the bars, a paramedic, a young woman, leaned out and shouted toward them. "We need to get in now. Open it." Jim turned back to Karen, his entire body shaking with rage. "You're playing games with my son's life." Karen's lips curved into a smirk. "I'm enforcing the rules, Jim." Jim didn't waste another second. He bolted toward the gate, gripping the metal bars and hauling himself up. "Jim, don't you dare!" Karen shrieked. "This is trespassing. You're violating HOA property." Jim ignored her, throwing himself over the top and landing hard on the other side. The paramedics followed, scaling the gate without hesitation. Karen's screams faded behind him as they sprinted toward his house. Ethan was waiting. Jim barely noticed the ache in his legs as he ran. His mind was fixed on one thing, Ethan. The paramedics were right behind him, their bags slamming against their sides as they sprinted toward the house. Karen's shrieks echoed from the gate, but Jim didn't care. If she wanted to call the cops, fine. Let her. He'd deal with it later. The moment they burst through the front door, Jim pointed toward Ethan's bedroom. Down the hall. Ethan was on the bed, his face pale, his breaths coming in short, desperate gasps. One of the paramedics knelt beside him, quickly fitting an oxygen mask over his face while the other prepared a nebulizer treatment. Jim crouched next to Ethan, gripping his son's hand. "Hang in there, buddy," he whispered. "Just breathe. You're gonna be okay." Ethan's panicked eyes met Jim's as the paramedics worked, their hands moving swiftly, their voices calm but urgent. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, Ethan's chest started rising in deeper, steadier breaths. His fingers loosened around Jim's hand. The tension in his small body eased. Jim exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Relief crashed over him, but it was quickly replaced by something else, pure, boiling rage. A sharp knock rattled the door. Jim already knew who it was before he even turned. He stood slowly, every muscle coiled tight, and walked toward the front door. He yanked it open. 2 police officers stood on the porch. And behind them, Karen. She stood with her arms folded, her chin lifted high, her expression smug as ever. If Jim hadn't been so furious, he might have laughed at the absurdity of it all. The taller officer cleared his throat. "Sir, we received a report about unauthorized trespassing and disorderly conduct." Jim blinked in disbelief. He turned to Karen, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "Are you serious?" Karen let out a small, theatrical sigh. "It's so unfortunate," she said, shaking her head. "I warned you about our rules, Jim, but you refused to listen. You caused a scene, you scaled private property, and you put this entire neighborhood at risk." Jim felt his jaw tighten to the point of pain. "My son was dying, Karen. You locked the damn gate." Karen gave a patronizing shake of her head. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. He's breathing just fine now, isn't he?" Jim barely contained himself. "Because I had to break your damn rules to get him the help he needed." A murmur rippled through the growing crowd. Neighbors had gathered outside, watching the exchange. Some whispered among themselves, but Jim noticed something different this time. Some of them weren't just watching, they were nodding. Frowning. Realizing. One voice rang out from the crowd. "That's a load of garbage, Karen." Jim turned to see Bill Carter, his next-door neighbor. Bill had always been the type to keep his head down, to avoid trouble. But now, he stepped forward, arms crossed, his face set in anger. "You didn't stop that ambulance because of rules," Bill said. "You stopped it because you wanted power over Jim. You wanted to punish him for questioning you." Karen's expression flickered, but she quickly recovered. "I was ensuring security procedures were followed." "Security?" Another voice cut in, Rachel Morgan, a single mother down the street. "You did the same thing to me last year when my daughter broke her arm. You refused to open the gate and told me I should have planned better for emergencies." More murmurs. More heads turning. Someone else spoke up. "She fined me for leaving my Christmas lights up a day too long. And she told me my front door color was too aggressive." Jim watched as the entire street slowly turned against Karen. For years, she had ruled over this neighborhood with intimidation, issuing fines, making rules, threatening people who dared question her. And for years, they had all taken it. But now? Now, they were seeing her for what she really was. The taller officer turned back to Jim, his expression more uncertain now. "Sir, if what these people are saying is true, that changes things." He glanced at the paramedics, who were still tending to Ethan inside. "Can you confirm that she refused emergency access?" One of the paramedics, a young woman with sharp eyes, stepped forward. "Absolutely. We had to climb the gate ourselves. That delay could have caused serious harm." The officer exchanged a look with his partner. Karen scoffed, her smug demeanor finally cracking. This is ridiculous. You can't take the word of some paramedics over the homeowners association. That was the wrong thing to say. Jim let out a short, bitter laugh. You hear that, folks? Karen thinks she's more important than emergency responders. A few neighbors actually laughed. Karen's eyes darted around, searching for support. Her usual loyalists, Greg and the other HOA enforcers, stood frozen, unsure whether to speak. Bill turned to the officers. If you're looking for a formal complaint, I'll be the first to file one. Rachel nodded. Make that two. The murmurs turned into full-on agreement. The officer sighed and turned to Karen. Ma'am, we're going to have to take a formal report on this. If it's determined that you obstructed emergency services, you could be facing legal consequences. Karen's face drained of color. Legal? You can't be serious. Jim crossed his arms. Oh, they're serious. And guess what? I'm pressing charges. For the first time, Karen actually looked scared. Neighbors started pulling out their phones, recording. A few were already calling the HOA Oversight Board. Karen's composure cracked completely. She turned to Greg, her most loyal HOA supporter. Greg, do something. Greg took a step back, shaking his head. Not this time, Karen. Her mouth opened and closed, panic flickering in her eyes. For years, Karen had ruled through fear. She had bullied, intimidated, and threatened people into silence. But tonight? She had pushed too far. Jim could see it in her face, the moment she realized she had finally lost. Karen Delacroix had always believed she was untouchable. For years, she had wielded the HOA like a personal weapon, bending the rules to fit her whims and punishing anyone who dared defy her. But now, standing in front of a crowd of angry neighbors, with police officers taking down reports and Jim Lawson pressing charges, she was losing control. Jim had expected Karen to fold, to back down and disappear under the weight of the public humiliation. Instead, she did what all power-hungry tyrants do when they feel the walls closing in, she escalated. The retaliation started the next morning. Jim woke up to find a violation notice taped to his front door, printed in bold red letters. Immediate action required, HOA fines and legal notice. Due to repeated violations of community standards, including unauthorized modifications to the property and disorderly conduct, a fine of $2,500 has been imposed. Failure to comply may result in legal action, including property lien. Jim clenched his jaw as he read it. This wasn't just a petty fine, this was Karen going for the kill. That same day, his mailbox was flooded with more violations, each more ridiculous than the last. Your lawn height exceeds the approved HOA standard by half an inch. Your front door is not in compliance with the neighborhood's approved color palette. Your trash cans were placed out before the approved time window. It was a targeted attack, designed to bury him in fines and paperwork, to make him regret standing up to her. Jim refused to be intimidated. He called his lawyer and prepared to fight back. But Karen had one more despicable move up her sleeve. That afternoon, Child Protective Services showed up at his door. The caseworker, a middle-aged woman with a professional but tired demeanor, stood on his porch, clipboard in hand. Mr. Lawson, we received an anonymous report that your son is living in an unsafe environment. Jim's stomach plummeted. Unsafe? His voice came out sharper than he intended. What the hell does that mean? The caseworker sighed. The report states that you failed to provide medical care for your son, leading to a severe health crisis. It also alleges that you were engaging in reckless and aggressive behavior around the child. Jim's blood boiled. He didn't need to ask who had made the report. Karen. She had tried to fine him into submission, and when that didn't work, she tried to make him look like a criminal. And now? Now, she was trying to take his son. He forced himself to stay calm. You realize this is retaliation, right? There are witnesses, police reports, and medical personnel who can confirm exactly what happened. The caseworker studied him for a long moment. I understand your frustration, Mr. Lawson. But we have to follow up on every report. Do you mind if we conduct a quick home assessment? Jim exhaled through his nose and stepped aside. Knock yourself out. The entire inspection was a joke. Jim had nothing to hide, his home was clean, Ethan was safe, and the caseworker quickly saw through the ridiculous accusations. I'll file my report, she said finally, offering him a sympathetic nod. But I'll be honest, this happens more than you'd think. People weaponizing CPS to settle personal vendettas. Jim smirked bitterly. Yeah, well, this time she picked the wrong guy. Karen had gone too far. The fines, the fake violations, the attempted character assassination, it all proved she wasn't just enforcing rules. She was on a personal vendetta. Jim wasn't going to just play defense anymore. It was time to go on the attack. That evening, he dug through HOA records. After hours of research, he found something big: financial statements from the last 3 years. Karen had stolen HOA funds. At first glance, the expenses looked routine: security upgrades, neighborhood improvements. But when Jim looked closer, he noticed a pattern. Every security enhancement had been on Karen's property. $7,800 spent on an advanced perimeter security system, installed on Karen's home, not the community. $3,500 on private surveillance cameras, also for Karen's house. $12,000 on landscaping improvements, for her own yard. She had embezzled HOA money to fortify her own home. Jim's grin was slow and sharp. He wasn't just going to fight back, he was going to bury her. The next morning, Jim walked straight into the HOA office, the folder of evidence in his hands. The receptionist's face paled when she saw him, but she didn't stop him as he marched toward the conference room. Inside, the HOA board members were mid-meeting when Jim slammed the folder onto the table. Before we start, he said, his voice calm but cold, I'd like to ask how the board plans to explain tens of thousands of dollars in missing HOA funds. The room fell silent. Karen's face went white. You have no right to. Jim slid the financial documents across the table. You stole HOA funds to build your own personal fortress. The records are right here. He leaned forward. And I'm guessing the police would love to see them. The other board members looked panicked. This is outrageous. Karen stammered, but no one was listening to her anymore. The HOA president, an older man named Alan Mitchell, turned toward Karen, his expression dark. Is this true? Karen swallowed hard. I was only ensuring community security. Bullshit. Jim folded his arms. You used HOA money for your own house. And now, everyone knows it. The room erupted into chaos. One board member stood up abruptly. We need to report this, we could be legally liable if we don't act. Alan sighed and rubbed his temples. We need an emergency vote. Effective immediately, Karen Delacroix is removed as HOA president. Karen's head snapped up. You can't do this. Alan barely looked at her. It's done. Jim grinned as Karen's world crumbled around her. She had spent years destroying lives, and now? Now, it was her turn. Jim stood on his front porch, arms crossed, watching as Karen Delacroix's reign finally crumbled. The neighborhood that had once lived in fear of her clipboard tyranny had now turned on her completely. With her HOA presidency revoked, her financial crimes exposed, and multiple legal actions pending, Karen had nowhere left to run. But true to form, she wasn't going down quietly. In the days following her removal, Karen lashed out in desperation. She sent out unauthorized HOA violation notices, demanding that residents pay fines she no longer had the authority to issue. She tried to rally her old supporters, but even Greg, the most loyal enforcer of her rules, had abandoned her. The HOA board, desperate to distance themselves from her corruption, released an official statement announcing her permanent ban from any leadership role. Then came the lawsuit. With the financial records Jim uncovered, a class action lawsuit was filed against Karen for embezzling thousands of dollars in HOA funds. The state attorney general got involved, launching an official investigation into fraud and misuse of community money. The charges weren't just civil. Karen was now facing criminal charges. When the police arrived at her house with a warrant for her arrest, neighbors watched from their porches, some whispering, others openly filming. Jim didn't bother to hide his smirk as Karen was led away in handcuffs, her screams about false accusations and HOA sovereignty drowned out by the neighborhood's collective sigh of relief. The fallout from Karen's downfall was swift and long overdue. The HOA board was forced to reform, implementing strict financial oversight policies and eliminating many of Karen's absurd regulations. Overnight, petty fines were dropped, architectural restrictions were relaxed, and HOA dues were reduced, all because residents no longer had to fund Karen's personal security fortress. The once stifled community slowly began to breathe again. Neighbors took back their homes. Some painted their front doors in bright, non-HOA approved colors. Others put up pink flamingos and garden gnomes, just to spite Karen's legacy. And for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like an actual community. As for Jim, he won every battle. The CPS report was dismissed as baseless, the fraudulent fines were erased, and Karen's attempted foreclosure on his house was thrown out in court. 1 month later, a moving truck appeared in Karen's driveway. She had been forced to sell her house to pay legal fees. No one came to say goodbye. Jim watched from his porch, coffee in hand, as Karen stepped into her car one last time. She caught his gaze, her eyes filled with pure, burning hatred. Jim raised his coffee in a mock toast. "Safe travels, Karen. Don't forget to measure the grass at your next place." She slammed her car door and sped off without another word. The neighborhood erupted into cheers. That evening, a massive block party was held in celebration. People Jim had never even spoken to before gathered in his yard, laughing, drinking, and finally enjoying the freedom they had been denied for years. Ethan ran around with the other kids, his laughter no longer drowned out by the weight of HOA rules. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Bill clapped Jim on the back. "Never thought I'd see the day," he said with a grin. Jim chuckled. "Took long enough." For the first time since moving in, Willow Ridge felt like home. No more fear, no more absurd fines, and no more Karen. But HOAs still ruled plenty of neighborhoods across the country. And so, the question remains, have you ever felt powerless against an HOA or a Karen in your life? Share your experience below, let's see who had it worse.